to you? Or
Okay, the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. Today's subcommittee will mark up two pieces of chemical legislation. H.R. 6160 would extend the authorization for the Department of Homeland Security's CFATS program for 18 months. Since 2007, chemical facilities have been regulated to address risks under the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, or CFATS program. But if Congress fails to act, the program will expire in April. When we held a legislative hearing on an extension in September, we identified a couple of modest improvements for the program. These reforms would ensure workers and local communities are being consulted and receiving the information they need to stay safe. For now, the priority must be preventing the program from expiring, but I am still happy to continue discussing how to improve the long-term protection of these facilities in the future. We will also consider H.R. 5544, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Leadership Act of 2020, which was introduced by Representatives Olson, Peters, Stefanik, and myself, and now has some 28 co-sponsors, half Republican and half Democratic. Companion legislation in the Senate has 34 bipartisan co-sponsors, and just this week, we witnessed the depth of that bipartisan support across the Capitol. This bill enjoys an impressive and diverse coalition of outside support as well, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the HVACR industry, from chemical and equipment manufacturers to contractors. This legislation would direct EPA to phase down hydrofluorocarbons, commonly known as HFCs, which are a class of chemicals primarily used as refrigerants. The bill is modeled on EPA's successful program to phase down HFC's predecessors, ozone-depleting substances. A global transition away from HFCs has begun, and the good news is American manufacturers are in a strong position to lead and benefit from this transition. U.S. manufacturers are already investing billions of dollars in the research and development to innovate new, environmentally friendly substitutes and maintain their global competitiveness. It has been estimated that a phase down at the rate included in this legislation would lead to some 33,000 new domestic manufacturing jobs, add some $12.5 billion to the U.S. economy every year for a decade, and increase HVACR exports by some 25%. We will only see those benefits if the transition proceeds in an orderly manner. On the other hand, failure to support this transition will ensure other countries realize the economic benefits that come from refrigerant innovation, and failure to manage uses of HFCs will ensure that China and other nations dump HFCs in the United States as other markets close. I want to make sure the record is clear about a few aspects of this bill. First, it would phase down, not phase out, the production and consumption of HFCs over 15 years. This ensures that niche users are protected, and essential use exceptions could be issued when no substitute is available. Second, this bill will not force consumers to replace equipment before the end of its useful life. There is existing older equipment that is still using CFCs that have not been manufactured in the United States for 25 years. This bill will allow HFCs to be recycled and reused for many years to come. Third, an orderly transition ensures that costs will be kept low for everyone. I think it is likely that consumers will actually benefit, but at the very least ensuring that manufacturers do not need to continue to make two sets of new products, one with HFCs and one with substitutes. That will keep costs down for everyone. This bill presents a unique bipartisan opportunity to advance a meaningful climate solution that has widespread support from the business and environmental communities, that will spur American private sector innovation and make our manufacturers more globally competitive, and that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions at no cost to the federal government and low to zero cost to consumers. This bill is proof that we can find solutions that grow the economy, promote innovation, and protect our environment. I am sure we will have a lively debate this morning, but I hope members will keep an open mind and think about all the unlikely allies that have come together to support this bill. With that, I yield back and now recognize I recognize the ranker of, I'm just looking at my notes. I was recognizing the ranking member, Representative Shimkus, for 5 minutes, please.
Just trying to help, Mr. Chairman, so you know me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me for an opening statement about today's markup. The subject matter of both of these bills, we are marking up, stir up strong opinions in more ways than one and for separate reasons. We have a long way to go today, but a short time to get there. The first bill, we are marking up legislation to extend the authority of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terror or CFATS program, is a must-pass bill. Congress first authorized the CFATS program in the fall of 2006. The program filled in gaps in federal law regarding terrorism and other international intentional acts against high-risk facilities due to their use of possession of chemicals of concern at levels of concern. Most importantly, to avoid overlapping with other federal programs, CFATS was designed to foster collaboration between government and regulated parties. I know members of both parties would have preferred either a much longer extension of the program or introduction of newer features that expanded the scope of the CFATS program. Insisting on those changes threatens to create a temporary legal vacuum and ultimately make our nation less secure, whether our domestic or international terrorists. It is important to remember that next month will mark the 25th anniversary of the most significant chemical-based terrorism attack in the United States soil, the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Not extending the program is not an option. The second bill we are marking up today, I feel much less urgency about its passage. H.R. 5544 is replete with policy deficits and outcomes that contradict stated policy goals. At the time of the January legislative hearing, I was greatly concerned about the lack of preemption and the possibility of market manipulation and product deselection that could occur and would adversely impact the need and pocketbooks of residential consumers. Since that time, the more I have learned about this bill and what it could mean, the more certain I am that we need regular order and additional hearings on this topic and not rush through the committee process. From what I can tell, the chief outside architects and champions of this bill are a couple of industry-specific trade associations and one non-governmental organization. Those same groups constituted the majority of the witnesses we heard from the January 14th subcommittee hearing. Limiting process and limiting viewpoints is not a productive approach to legislating. Indeed, now that this bill is moving in our committee, the bill sponsors have tried to move it in the other body. There are stakeholders from many other sectors that are concerned about the negative impacts of this bill, whether it's people who use pepper spray to defend against assaults, asthmatics who need reliable delivery of their drugs, asthmatics who need reliable delivery of their drugs to fend off life-threatening pleural diseases, or aircraft companies that need fire protection equipment that protects the flying public from disaster. We must consider stakeholders beyond the refrigeration and air conditioning industries. In addition, as I mentioned at the January hearing, the Illinois-based North American Association of Food Equipment Manufacturers is the lead trade association for commercial food service refrigeration product. Since 2015, the commercial food service refrigeration industry has proactively undertaken transitioning away from HFCs to meet customer demands. How many other parts of the impacted universe are also making this transition without a government mandate? Finally, I think it bears mentioning that we should be exploring the constitutional precedent of this proposal, an effort to implement requirements necessary for participation in the Kakali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. This amendment has not been submitted to the Senate for ratification by either the Obama or now the Trump administration. While I understand the attractiveness of the proposal like this to some, I wonder whether the federal court would see this as a durable solution. Mr. Chairman, I respect that you and Chairman Pallone are trying to get a product ready for the floor, minus substantial changes to several parts of H.R. 5544, though I do not intend to support it in its current form, and I'll ask my colleagues to vote against it, and I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. The chair now recognizes Chairman Pallone, chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Today, we're marking up a bill to promote American manufacturing and innovation, protect communities and consumers, and address the climate crisis. When we'll first consider H.R. 6160, a bill to extend the authorization for the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Program, commonly referred to as CFATS. Without this bill, the CFATS program will end next month, leaving dangerous chemicals unguarded and the surrounding communities at risk. Now, the CFATS program obviously isn't perfect. We need serious changes in the program to address transparency, environmental justice, worker participation, resilience, and more. and I had hoped to bring up a comprehensive CFATS reauthorization bill to make these important changes. Unfortunately, this administration and some in the Senate want this program to expire. President Trump's budget eliminated the CFATS program, and the Senate Republican chairman responsible for the program has repeatedly said that he supports eliminating it. But eliminating the program with no alternative in place would create unnecessary and unreasonable risks for the communities around these facilities. And for that reason, I have been negotiating with my colleagues on this committee, on the House Homeland Security Committee, and in the Senate to find a path to continue the program. And this bill, I think, provides that path, and I strongly urge all of my colleagues on both sides to support it. The next bill is H.R. 5544, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Leadership Act, or the AIM Leadership Act. This bipartisan legislation offers us a unique opportunity to support American manufacturing leadership, protect consumers, create jobs, and confront the climate crisis, all at zero cost to the taxpayer. And I commend Chairman Tonko and Representatives Olson, Peters, and Stefanik for their leadership on the bill, as well as the 12 other Republicans and 12 other Democrats who've co-sponsored it. I also want to thank the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Chamber of Commerce, and the National Association of Manufacturers for their support. In fact, H.R. 5544 is widely supported by both industry and the environmental community because they recognize that what's good for the economy can be good for the environment and vice versa. The global shift away from hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, is already underway, but absent a strong federal framework, American manufacturers risk falling behind in this transition, and American consumers face the risk of price hikes. So H.R. 5544 builds upon our previous experience phasing out ozone-depleting substances and their replacement chemicals. Transitioning away from those substances helped heal the ozone layer, but the shift to HFCs has presented new challenges because they're potent greenhouse gases. Prior phase-downs of ozone-depleting substances have not only been seamless, but also less costly to businesses and consumers than expected. And this bill puts the country on a path to replicate that success. Mr. Chairman, American companies are already developing new innovative alternatives to HFCs, but they have warned that without a federal framework, the transition will be slower, less efficient, and more expensive to consumers than it needs to be. In fact, U.S. manufacturers have indicated they're already at risk of losing their competitive advantage to foreign companies. So if signed into law, H.R. 5544 will help the U.S. maintain its position as a leader in the chemical, appliance, and equipment industries. The legislation will provide the policy certainty manufacturers need to reap the benefits of their investments in innovation, and it will ensure a transition to next-generation technologies that is predictable and less costly. The AIM Leadership Act will help companies not only to remain competitive in the global market for air conditioning, heating, and other consumer products, but also increase their share of the global market, and it could potentially create tens of thousands of high-quality American jobs, and we expect it will save American consumers billions of dollars. In addition, the climate benefits of transitioning away from HFCs can't be overstated. These chemicals are enormously powerful greenhouse gases. Phasing down their use would significantly reduce climate-damaging emissions, and I'm encouraged by recent bipartisan interest in climate action. And since this legislation comes with zero cost to the federal government, I see no reason why members on both sides of the aisle would not support it. Again, this bill is a win for the economy, a win for consumers, and a win for the environment. And I want to thank my colleagues on both sides for their leadership on both of these bills that we're considering today, and look forward to working to advance the bills to the full committee, where obviously we can continue to work on improvements. Thank you, Chairman Tonko. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and we thank you, Chairman Pallone. Are there?
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that the ranking member of the full committee's statement be submitted into the record.
Without exemption, we will include that in the record. Are there any other members seeking recognition to make an opening statement? We recognize Representative Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the committee staff for the opportunity to debate the American Innovation and Manufacturing Leadership Act, a bill that I proudly co-sponsored with Chairman Tonko, and that enjoys widespread support from industry, public health advocates, and environmental groups. I urge my colleagues to pass this bill for three simple reasons. It's good for jobs, good for the economy, good for the environment. It would increase U.S. manufacturing jobs by 33,000, increase exports of HVACR equipment by 25%, limit for the first time imports of foreign-produced HFCs, and avoid half a degree of global warming by the end of the century. It almost seems too good to be true, but it is true. We are here today because the federal government has thus far failed to provide industry with clear regulatory guidance on HFCs. In 2017, the courts only complicated matters with a ruling that resulted in the EPA's decision to suspend EPA's final rule prohibiting certain end uses of HFCs. It's no surprise then that states have taken the lead in the HFC phase-down. Whereas several states have implemented those EPA rules affecting specific end uses, this bill is focused on a national framework to phase down the production and consumption of HFCs. And as the rest of the world transitions away from HFCs, we in Congress must provide the industry with the regulatory certainty needed to meet the growing worldwide demand for HFC alternatives that comply with international commitments. Luckily, we have a bit of an edge. American companies have been investing in advanced refrigerants and equipment for decades. In fact, we are a major producer of other alternative refrigerants. However, according to a recently published study by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the balance of trade is changing as China and Japan steadily gain market share in the export markets. This bill would protect our American manufacturers against the dumping of highly subsidized HFCs. As I raised at our hearing in January, manufacturers have had long-standing concerns that foreign producers of HFCs are exporting them to the U.S. and heavily subsidizing their price, which undercuts American-made products and potentially violates trade rules. If we don't pass this legislation before us today, our market remains open to this dumping. Passing this bill is critical to support our American manufacturers. We need our domestic policy to align with the reality that the market for HFCs is global. I urge my colleagues to join a remarkably diverse coalition in supporting a bill that's good for jobs, good for the economy, and good for the environment. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and we thank him. Any other members choosing to seek recognition to make an opening statement? Seeing none, that concludes our opening statements. Pursuant to committee rules, members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record, including that of full committee ranker Walden. Please submit written opening statements to the clerk's desk. And at this time, we'll begin bill consideration. The chair calls up 6160, a bill to extend the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards program of the Department of Homeland Security. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 6160, a bill to extend the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards program of the Department of Homeland Security.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. The bill is considered as read and open for amendment now. Are there any members who seek recognition to offer an amendment? Amendment?
No, I want to strike last word in support of the underlying bill.
Okay. The chair recognizes, seeing no amendments, will now recognize Representative Shimkus for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I said some of this in the opening statement of the committee, but I want to just reemphasize how this is the time to act. I am concerned that 18 months is way too short for extension for CFAT's program, but 18 months is far preferable to 0 months, which is what we get if the program's authority is not extended by April 17th. So I want to thank those who in the different committees of jurisdiction for at least getting us here where we're at today. First, regulated high-risk facilities make decisions daily about whether they will make the investments necessary to comply with this program. A shorter extension discourages that investment because too much uncertainty about the program's complexion and future. Second, a shorter extension encourages experienced workers to flee CFAT's program and search for other more stable employment. One of the biggest issues that dogged the CFAT's program and its major deficits in the early years, which we all went through, was a lack of a trained, competent, and focused workforce. It would be truly sad now that the program has worked so hard to correct its problems to knowingly create an environment ripe for old mistakes. Last, an 18-month extension will enable all the committees of jurisdiction in both bodies to be up and running in a new Congress before tackling this issue again. I wish we were talking about reporting a much longer extension or even an extension of at least 2 years, something between my desire for 3 and my colleagues' desire for a 1 year. But that's what compromise is all about. So here we are at 18 months, and I urge all my colleagues on both sides to support H.R. 6160 and hope that these provisions will become law as soon as possible. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I would say that this is a very important program that speaks to public health and public safety. Certainly, with the expiration coming soon in April, it is important for us to extend this program. I think it's a clean, straightforward extension. Obviously, there are some reforms that we would want to advance, but this at least speaks to the continuity and extension of the program in a way that serves in an effective manner. So with that, I'll yield back and recognize if there's anyone else that chooses to speak on the bill. Anyone on our Republican side that chooses to speak on the bill? Seeing none, is there anyone on the, we'll recognize the representative from California. Representative, okay.
Aragon.
Recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I think it's important we reauthorize H.R. 6160, the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Program, to ensure our most sensitive facilities are protected from terrorist attacks. However, I hope we can use the next 18 months until the next reauthorization to take a broader look at the location and safety of these facilities. I have strong concerns with some facilities in and near my district that comply with CFATs, in particular oil refineries and a facility called the Rancho Liquefied Petroleum Gas Facility. Just 2 weeks ago, an oil refinery in my district in Carson had an explosion that sent flames at least 100 feet into the air. Homes 2 miles away shook. The oil refinery and others in the region have a history of accidents, explosions, and releases of toxic pollution. The Rancho facility in San Pedro has above-ground storage tanks over 40 years old, storing up to 25 million gallons of butane, less than 1,500 feet from schools and homes, also near a fault line with a potential earthquake magnitude of 7.3. The blast radius for a worst-case scenario ranges from half a mile to 6.8 miles, depending on who is calculating, though either one of these would be catastrophic for the region. A blast would take out the port of Los Angeles and residents who live nearby. That's why I have a proposed legislation to relocate these dangerous facilities away from population centers, and I'm working on budget requests to provide greater funding for safety inspections and a risk analysis of the dangers. I will support the CFAT's reauthorization because terrorism is a threat we need to protect these facilities against. But we also need oversight to protect against negligence. We need protection against natural disasters. I will continue to fight for our communities living near these dangerous facilities to be safe from all potential harms. With that, I yield back.
Representative Barragan yields back. Are there any other colleagues that choose to speak on the bill? Recognizing that there are none, the question now occurs on favorably forwarding H.R. 6160 to the full committee. All those in favor of forwarding H.R. 6160 to the full committee signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed, saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. H.R. 6160 is forwarded to the full committee. At this time, we'll begin bill consideration. The chair calls up 5544, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Leadership Act of 2020. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5544, a bill to create jobs and drive innovation and economic growth in the United States by supporting and promoting the manufacture of next-generation technologies.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Representative Peters to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment, please.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5544, offered by Mr. Peters of California. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Representative Peters is now recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to offer this amendment in the nature of a substitute to make technical improvements to this already strong legislation. This AINS includes several common-sense edits that reflect concerns that were raised by members at the legislative hearing held on this bill in January. We appreciate all of our colleagues participating and giving us ideas for how to improve our bill. Those concerns largely touched on technical assistance on the legislation that EPA provided. We appreciate EPA's assistance in particular, and my amendment addresses EPA's comments appropriately. It's important to note that the amendment does not change the policy of this important legislation. Instead, it makes minor clarifying and technical edits, and I'd like to briefly explain a few of the changes we propose. A few of the edits adopt EPA's recommendations for streamlining certain requirements. For example, EPA told us that it already has certain data from 1989 needed to calculate the baselines, so we have struck the requirement that companies report that information. Similarly, we have struck the requirement that EPA include all isomers of regulated substances in the list the agency is required to maintain pursuant to Section 3. We also incorporated EPA's request for coordination language in Section 7 to help, as EPA testified at our legislative hearing, to help ensure that no duplicative requirements are inadvertently created. We also clarified provisions that my colleagues raised at the legislative hearing, such as the savings provision in Section 3 and the application of the criteria in Section 7 to any rulemakings undertaken pursuant to that section. Finally, the amendment makes certain revisions to remove any doubts about public participation and transparency. With respect to the petitions filed under Sections 5 or 7, this amendment adds additional clarity regarding the public availability in full of any petitions. Section 7 already required that the agency explain its decisions on granting or denying any petitions. If EPA denies a petition, it must explain why in the Federal Register. If EPA grants a petition, it then will notice a notice of proposed rulemaking that will articulate the agency's proposed action based on its decision to grant the petition. And the AINS makes clear that the public will have an opportunity to participate in that notice and comment rulemaking. In summary, the AINS amendment makes common sense, clarifying, and technical improvements that should be easy to support. I urge adoption of the amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Shimkus, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
To speak against the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We oppose, obviously, the underlying bill and now the amendment nature of substitute for a couple reasons, and we're not going to elaborate too much on them, but we want to highlight them and so our colleagues understand the concern. First, it compels compliance with a treaty that has not been ratified by the Senate nor submitted to the Senate for consideration by either President Obama or President Trump. It creates a weak and disjointed federal mandatory system as opposed to allowing a market-based approach that is already driving down HFCs in the United States, fails to prioritize the practical impacts of these phase downs on the consumer, particularly residential consumers, from cost burdens to access to essential life-saving devices and materials. It allows for the creation of a patchwork of uncertainty between various state requirements in this area by failing to include preemption, permits any outside entity to drive the acceleration of any scheduled phase down through a secretive and less than rigorous petition process with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, allows any outside entity to have EPA ban or severely limit HFC usage in sectors or subsectors of the economy without EPA demonstrating a reason for it, and inadequately provides for essential use exemptions such as inhalers, pepper spray, bear spray, and fire suppressants. Let me read, I guess the frustrating thing that I've been seeing in the committee, which I'll be leaving at the end of this year, is we're failing to adhere to a constitutional principle called the Interstate Commerce Clause. And let me read just 2 paragraphs on the Interstate Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause describes an enumerated power listed in the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. The clause states that the United States Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among several states and Indian tribes. Courts and commentators have tended to discuss each of these three areas of commerce as separate powers granted to Congress. It is common to see individual components of the Commerce Clause referred to under specific terms: the Foreign Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, and the Indian Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause emerged as a framer's response to the central problem giving rise to the Constitution itself: the absence of any federal commerce power under the Articles of Confederation. As a former U.S. history teacher in high school, I talked about this provision all the time as the basis for the new Constitution, which we now live under. For the first century of our history, the primary use of the clause was to preclude the kind of discriminatory state legislation that had once been permissible. Then, in response to rapid industrial development and an increasingly interdependent national economy, Congress ushered in a new era of federal regulation under the commerce power, beginning with the enactment of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The point is, the two main problems with this bill is it doesn't give the federal government preeminence in one standard across the nation, so it doesn't comply with the Interstate Commerce Clause. And then it also has this Accelerator Clause, which then will allow outside entities to enter into some agreement to quicken this enactment of this standard. Gosh, I wish we would just allow the federal government to set a standard and not allow states to then set their own standard. I know there's a difference of opinion. I know there are states that think they're smarter and richer and more powerful than the federal government, but there's a reason why the Interstate Commerce Clause was enacted, and it was so that states would not fight with states over regulations. Again, there's a lot of reasons why we live under the Constitution we live under today. I would argue that the Interstate Commerce Clause is the primary reason so that states would not just fight commercially, would go to war with each other over inability to enter markets. So without state preemption and without addressing this Accelerator Clause, we will have problems. I appreciate my friends and colleagues, and I just had to get that off my chest, and I'll be done. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Upon discussion with the minority this morning, we have determined to move forward with the amendments, and then after the amendments are addressed, we will then proceed with debate on the underlying bill. Are there any other members seeking recognition to offer an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I have an amendment at desk, Mr. Chairman.
For what purposes does the member seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
And Madam, the clerk will report
01.
the amendment, please.
4.
Looks like 4.
Yes, sir, I have it. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5544 offered by Mr. Shimkus. At the end, add the following section, section blank.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, please. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the main goals of H.R. 5544 is to give U.S. companies the certainty they need to make the investments necessary to phase down production of hydrofluorocarbons and ramp up the production and use of next-generation coolants. HFCs are used mainly as refrigerants in commercial and residential air conditioning and food storage machinery, including vending machines. HFCs also used in building insulation, fire suppression systems, and aerosols. While many foreign countries are pursuing HFC phase down under the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, 8 states, led by California, are pursuing their own enforceable HFC phase downs. In the past year, California, Vermont, and Washington State have passed legislation to reduce HFC use. Of note, California and Vermont plan a 40% reduction in HFC levels by 2013 by 2030. Delaware, Maryland, and New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey have committed to issue new regulations or have introduced legislation to curb specific HFC uses. While each has committed to act, the requirements are not all the same, creating conflicting standards for equipment, substances sold, and interstate commerce. H.R. 5544 phases down by 2036 the production and use of HFCs in the United States to a level that is equal to 15% of their production and use in 1989. It does not, however, expressly prohibit other states and local governments from acting in this space and creating different standards, frustrating the purpose of the national HFC framework that is intended in H.R. 5544. We've seen in the climate change context, chemicals management context, the CAFE and fuel standard context, and now the HFC context, that states are increasingly emboldened to regulate in areas that interfere with interstate commerce, regardless of whether the federal government has. This fragmented marketplace makes it difficult for manufacturers to cleanly and equally access consumers across the nation. In addition, states able to assert market power through their policies destroy consumer choice and skew the ability to have lower cost products available for use. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The ranking member Shimkus yields back. I move to strike the last word and recognize myself for 5 minutes. I oppose the amendment seeking to add state preemption provisions to this bill. It's important to recognize that what this bill would do and what certain states have done are not the same. The states have adopted requirements about the use of HFCs in specific applications, largely the same as what EPA adopted several years ago. The states are not regulating production and consumption, which is what this bill does. Under the bill's phase-down schedule, if properly implemented by EPA, many companies will transition completely away from HFCs in the mid-2020s. This is because it is costly to make two types of the same equipment, one with HFCs and one without. It is cheaper, easier, and more profitable to transition at one fell swoop. Once a company has transitioned out of HFCs, it won't matter if the states have a more stringent standard on the books, because those companies won't be in the business of using HFCs. This also means that states aren't likely to invest their time and resources in further regulating in this space. But that doesn't mean the states don't have a role to play. States have always been allowed to regulate the usage of HFCs, and this has never presented a problem. It is the absence of a federal framework that is creating a problem, not the efforts of the states to fill that gap in federal regulation. And importantly, the states play a role in keeping EPA honest. The ability of the states to regulate in this space is critical to ensuring that EPA properly implements this legislation and does so in a timely manner. I oppose the amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. I have some 3.5 minutes remaining. Are there any colleagues that choose to speak on the amendment? We recognize Representative Pallone, Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. I also oppose the amendment with regard to adding state preemption to this bill. Let's remember that at the heart of many of our environmental laws is a partnership between the federal government and the states. The federal government sets a strong floor, but the states have the option to set more stringent standards. And this has long been a successful approach. And as we've heard from industry and from expert testimony, the long history of regulation under Title VI of the Clean Air Act demonstrates that preemption is unnecessary. But the real problem here, and the reason the states have acted, is to fill the vacuum created by federal inaction. So what this bill does is resumes the federal government's leadership in this area and provides business the certainty that they need. And it's important to recognize the incredible support that this legislation enjoys in its current form without the preemption. U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, the entire heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and refrigeration sector, from the producers of HFCs to equipment manufacturers to contractors who install the equipment. 28 members of the House are co-sponsors of the bill, evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. 34 senators are co-sponsors of companion legislation in the Senate that also does not have preemption in it, again, evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. So my point is there's extremely strong support for this legislation without preemption, and I'm fearful that the amendment creates a problem and doesn't solve it. So I oppose it, and I urge my colleagues to vote no, and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other colleagues? Going to take your only, okay. Are there any colleagues from the Republican side that choose to speak to the amendment? Seeing none, are there any other colleagues? The chair recognizes the representative from Delaware, Representative
Move to strike the last word.
The representative is recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have suggested that H.R. 5544 is incomplete without state pre-exemption provisions. In reality, there is simply no need to add preemption to this legislation. It is wholly unnecessary and distracts from what this legislation actually aims to accomplish. What is missing? What we have heard from industry and environmental groups alike is a federal framework. That's what this bill does. It replicates our success in transitioning from ozone-depleting substances to phase down the use of HFCs. It provides the requisite level of certainty that industry needs to make investments here at home in the next generation technologies. The states that have acted by adopting former federal regulations have done so to fill the gap in the absence of federal regulation. But the existence of those state requirements is not the problem for industry that we're trying to solve. It is the absence of a federal framework. When we fill that gap by enacting this common sense bill, the states will not have to waste their limited time and resources by pursuing further regulation of HFCs. That does not mean, however, that we should depart from the successful structure that Title VI to now preempt the states. Preemption is unnecessary. This amendment is nothing more than a solution in search of a problem, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Are there any other colleagues choosing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, we will now proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I'd like to call recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
The amendment is not agreed to. My colleague seeks a recorded vote. So we will have those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Those opposed will now have the clerk call the roll, please.
Ms. Clark? No. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Ms. Berrigan? Ms. Berrigan, no. Mr. McEachin? Mr. Blunt? I'm sorry, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Ruiz? Ms. Ruiz votes no. Mrs. Dingell? Mrs. Dingell votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Shimkus?
Mr. Shimkus says yes.
Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers votes aye. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores, aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no.
No. Does any member still need to record their vote?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, are you ready for the total?
Yeah, if not, the clerk will report the tally, please.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas were 9 and the nays were 10.
The vote is 10 ayes to 9 noes.
No, sir. 9 ayes, 10 noes.
Excuse me. 9 ayes, 10 noes.
Yes, sir.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to this amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have another amendment at the desk. It's which one? Number 1.
The chair recognizes,
We have the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
what number is it? The clerk will report amendment number 1, please.
Yes, sir. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5544 offered by Mr. Shimkus. Strike Section 5D.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be waived. And the chair recognizes Representative Shimkus for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been curious with my colleagues and some of their statements in defense of this bill because they, and I'm quoting them, it fills a gap with a roadmap, and I would say that it creates actually more confusion with 2 provisions. One, there's no state preemption, so that means states can continue to do whatever they want. And the second thing is what I'm going to talk about now is the Accelerator Clause. I want to read this a little bit slower so I get all these points out because I haven't talked about this as much as I have in the past. This amendment strikes one of the most anti-consumer features of this bill, the accelerator phase down. Under the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the production and consumption of baseline percentages of HFCs subject to the legislation are gradually phased down to 15% by 2036, considering that essential use exemptions aren't available until 2034. This is already a pretty robust decline in HFC production and consumption. But then here comes the accelerator phase down. First, this provision prevents any person starting in 2024 to petition the EPA to disregard the consumption and production phase down, to disregard it, which means change, and schedule and institute the regulation of covered substances that is more stringent. Stringent, though, is not defined. The amendment in the nature of a substitute opens the possibility to any level, including going below the floor Congress is setting. Second, the only criteria EPA has to find to grant the petition is that the more stringent phase down is, quote unquote, practicable, based on the availability of substitutes, any substitutes. The amendment in the nature of a substitute does not require the substitutes to be technically or economically feasible, just that it be practical that substitutes would be available. Third, the amendment in the nature of a substitute makes no effort to prevent the adverse impacts that the petition will have for consumers, particularly costs for end users and residential ones. The HFC-HFO debate is 10 times more expensive for the consumer at current prices. This is a glaring omission that completely disregards the financial resources of lower-income Americans that rely on these products to stay alive. And we know Mark Wayne Mullen is not here because of the injury to his son. And those of you who were at the legislative hearing knows how passionate he was about this being an installer of this type of equipment. And I cannot fill his shoes in the debate, as he was very emotionally involved and engaged. Fourth, it's nearly impossible if you are adversely impacted by a rule to challenge it. The standard of judicial review is, quote unquote, arbitrary and capricious, end quotes. And all EPA has to say to win is that it was told that it was, quote unquote, practical. Moreover, under these provisions, the fact that a petition has been lodged with EPA is a secret until EPA either denies the petition or proposes a rule to implement it. EPA is not required to post the fact that it has been petitioned and seek comment on the correctness and assertions made in the petition. Fifth, any petitioner only has to show that there is an adequate data to support the petition. It does not require any level of rigor or quality assurance to the data or that there are technically sound, viable, and affordable substitutes. The amendment in nature of substitute also does not require EPA to reject an insufficiently filed petition. Instead, it requires EPA to use all its legal authority to fill in the gaps of the petition so that it meets whatever necessary legal requirements there are. This is an astounding waste of resources by the federal government to guarantee an outcome. Finally, even though the amendment in nature of a substitute delays the use of these provisions until 2024, essential use exemptions cannot be granted until 2034. So EPA could grant petitions that accelerate the phase-down schedule well before it could grant exemptions to uses of HFCs that are essential. In summary, this amendment allows any person, regardless of economic or ideological motive, to petition EPA to reduce HFCs to an unknown but more stringent level. The petition is kept secret until EPA is either regulating or rejecting the petition. The petition doesn't have to be of any quality because EPA is required to fill in the blanks. The cost to working Americans are not even a consideration, and these petitions are given a higher priority in the bill than providing essential use exemptions. It's a great deal if you can get it, and I don't get it. I urge support of my amendment, and I would just say, again, quoting Mark Wayne, in this whole debate, we have not talked about the individual consumer and household costs. I think we're taking care of the Kigali Amendment. I think we're taking care of some manufacturers of either of equipment or the coolant, but we are not talking about consumers and their costs, and that's why I offer this amendment. I yield back my time.
Representative Shimkus yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognitions to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from California, Representative Peters, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate Mr. Shimkus' comments and do remember Mr. Mullen's discussion. I think we have discussed many of these issues, and particularly the effect on consumers. And I do oppose this amendment. Section 5D of H.R. 5544 authorizes EPA to consider petitions to implement a more stringent phase-down schedule. This provision is based on existing authority that the EPA has under Title VI of the Clean Air Act to accelerate phase-down schedules when certain technological conditions are met. EPA's Title VI authority has been invoked multiple times for commercial and competitiveness reasons, either by industry or with the support of industry. It has played an important role in balancing the marketplace, assuring predictable supplies and prices, and minimizing overall costs for industry and consumers. Industry first petitioned to accelerate the phase-out of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, in the 1990s, then supported an environmental group's petition to accelerate the HCFC phase-out in the 2000s. Industry and environmental groups both support including the same authority in H.R. 5544. As with prior transitions, the HFC transition will likely happen well ahead of the phase-down schedule, since the market moves much faster than the proposed schedule in our experience. Keeping up with the market means allowing for an accelerated schedule. And just like during prior transitions, the absence of an appropriately timed schedule is precisely what provides regulatory certainty. The presence of an appropriately timed schedule is what provides certainty. It's also important to recognize that EPA can't accelerate the phase-down based on the whims of the administrator or an environmental group or even one industry competitor. Let's look at the mechanics of the bill to understand the guardrails on this authority. Before EPA can implement a faster phase-down schedule, the administrator has to determine that a more stringent schedule is practicable. How does EPA determine this? EPA has to evaluate the availability of substitutes, considering technological achievability, commercial demands, safety, and the availability of reclaimed HFCs or HFCs previously produced or imported. In addition, a petition seeking a more stringent schedule must include a showing that there are adequate data to support the petition. If, based on this robust analysis, EPA concludes that a more stringent schedule is practicable, then EPA will grant a petition and issue a proposed rule outlining its analysis and proposal. That proposal will then be subject to notice and comment, giving all stakeholders and the public an opportunity to weigh in. After all this, EPA will then issue a final rule after considering all public comments, and if any regulated entity believes EPA has acted arbitrarily or capriciously, it can seek judicial review. This is a reasonable grant of authority to EPA. The amendment is at odds with the proven track record and would not improve this legislation. Quite the opposite, in fact. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any members on our minority side that choose to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, are there others that choose to speak on the amendment? We'll recognize Representative McNerney for 5 minutes, please.
I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I appreciate this ranking member's passion on this, but I respectfully oppose the amendment. It's important to note that accelerating the phase-down schedule that H.R. 5544 authorizes would not affect or apply to existing equipment. In fact, nothing in H.R. 5544 would require anyone to replace any equipment using HFCs before its natural end of life. For example, there are still CFC-based refrigerators in operation, even though CFCs were last produced in the United States more than 25 years ago. An accelerated phase-down schedule would not increase costs to businesses or consumers. As discussed by my colleague, Mr. Peters, the EPA could not establish an accelerated schedule unless the market was there to support it. In fact, EPA's ability to accelerate phase-down schedules has proven to be more of an important policy tool for avoiding market disruptions. Industry and consumers need a stable planning and investment framework protected both against price spikes due to shortages of available alternatives and against price crashes due to oversupply of alternatives. To protect against shortages and price spikes at the end of phase down, H.R. 5544 already provides for essential use exemptions if needed to increase the supply of HFCs, including for niche uses. The acceleration authority is needed to protect against negative outcomes if the current program is continued without acceleration. If innovation and market transformation happens faster than expected, industry and consumer investments in alternatives can be severely disrupted without acceleration, with negative environmental as well as economic impacts. For example, there could be an oversupply of newly produced HFCs. This will tend to destroy the market for companies that invest in scaling up capacity to recover HFCs from old equipment and recycle that material for service purposes or reuse in new products. Under acceleration, if allowed to grow and operate under predictable conditions, the recovery and recycle industry can extend the supply of HFCs well beyond the 15-year phase-down period. This is critical to keep long-lived equipment built to use HFCs in operation. Tens of thousands of long-lived building chillers will remain in operation, for example, well into the 2030s and 2040s. They will benefit from a stable supply of recycled HFCs. If the growth of recovery and recycling industry is disrupted because the near-term market was flooded with an oversupply of HFCs, the recovery recycling industry will never properly develop. This is precisely why the accelerated phase-down authority is critical to ensuring flexibility and protecting against unintended market disruptions. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members from the minority that choose to speak to the amendment? Seeing none, any other members on the majority side that choose to speak to the amendment? If there's no further debate, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Mr. Shimkus asked for recorded vote. A recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Those opposed to the amendment will say no. The clerk shall call the roll, please.
Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Ms. Berrigan? Ms. Berrigan, no. Mr. McEachin? Ms. Blunt-Rochester? Ms. Blunt-Rochester, no. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto, no. Mr. Gett? Mr. Gett votes no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Ruiz? Mr. Ruiz, no. Mrs. Dingell? Mrs. Dingell, no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Shimkus? Aye. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers votes aye. Mr. McKinley? Ms. McKinley, aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Flores? Aye. Mr. Flores, aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Carter? Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no.
Does any member still need to record her or his vote?
Mr. Pallone?
Votes no.
Mr. Pallone votes no.
And Mr. Carter?
Mr. Carter votes. Mr. Carter votes aye.
Does any member wish to change her or his vote? If not, we will have the clerk report the tally, please.
Yes, sir. On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 9 and the nays were 13.
The vote is 9 ayes to 13 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The representative from Washington State, Representative Rogers, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The state of Washington has a proud history in aerospace and aviation. These industries have made significant contributions to Washington's economy, and we want to ensure the aircraft manufactured in our state is safe. I also represent Fairchild Air Force Base, the largest tanker refueling wing of the U.S. Air Force. And that's why I'm concerned about the threat that H.R. 5544 poses to the safety of airline transportation and military aircraft. With the increased complexity of circuitry and computerization of operational aircraft systems that help make air travel as safe as possible, it's also important that fire suppression systems on these aircraft are efficient, effective, and will not harm the underlying equipment. The complexity of the equipment and the environment aircraft operates in unique challenges when it comes to fire suppression. For decades, aerospace and aviation manufacturers have widely relied on halons as the most effective fire suppression agent for commercial aircraft. They're very effective at extinguishing a variety of fires, including flammable liquids, electronics, and common combustibles. Used in small quantities, halons are non-toxic to humans, non-corrosive, and compatible with most materials. However, halons have significant impacts on the environment, including depletion of ozone layer. The phase down was added to the Montreal Protocol, and the industry began investigating and transitioning to a non-halon alternative to protect against fires in engines, cargo compartments, military aircraft, fuel craft, and occupied crew areas. The industry has been relying on several HFC substances to replace these halons for various fire suppression systems on aircraft. But under H.R. 5544, these replacement substances would all be subject to the mandatory federal government phase-down. Moreover, this bill does not provide an essential use exemption for these necessary substances until 2034 at the earliest. This makes no sense. Not considering the safety of our military and commercial aircraft as worthy of special attention is bad policy. And it's the result you get when you abandon regular order and move legislation that protects and promotes the bottom line of only a few interests. Several state-level HFC laws and regulations have, to varying degrees, recognized the need to continue the use of HFCs for fire suppression in aircraft. I hope the chairman agrees that this issue needs to be rectified immediately, and I ask that you work to exempt fire suppression substances in aircraft from inclusion and make the essential use exemption available on the date of enactment. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? The chair recognizes Representative McKinley for 5 minutes, please.
As I asked you, Mr. Chairman, I have no illusion that our concerns on this side of the aisle are going to be heard or going to change the trajectory of this legislation. We know you're on a fast pace to try to get this accomplished, but I see we're not going to address the airplane manufacturers. We're not going to address the Chinese emissions, the technology transitions, the pepper spray, bear spray, vending machines, marine manufacturing, international treaties, and by one vote, you prevented us from adopting into this a preemption clause. So, but let's focus just for a minute back on the background on the Chinese. Just for background, China and India apparently account for 75% of all the hydrocarbons that are produced globally. And in 2015, China and India pledged, operative word, pledged, to reduce their HFC emissions. But as of last year, all their emissions have actually increased. So they're not committed. They're just simply not committed to do what is necessary to reduce this across the world. Oh, interestingly enough, China and the United States are neither of us are members of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. But unlike China, H.R. 5554 will place a legal requirement for the United States to do so. China obviously has no intentions of complying with that reduction. Therefore, America is once again going to be acting unilaterally to try to solve a global problem that's going to continue to be exacerbated. Moreover, H.R. 5544 is skewed in favor of taking those products off the market without regard to the cost, practicality, or the cost impact to consumers. Put it in perspective. American manufacturers, this is my, I've got enough involvement in this as engineering with a firm on this. American manufacturers originally used R22 in their units, but in an effort to try to reduce ozone, they switched to 410A. Now, 410A did make a savings to the environment, but it operates at a higher temperature and required the use of larger coils, so the HVAC equipment had to be replaced. The coils couldn't fit into the unit, so they had to find new manufacturing to be able to take care of that. And what happened? It was passed on to the consumer. They're now shifting to a new coolant, 435B, which is it's a substitute. But the problem with it, it still contains HFCs. So we're seeing under this legislation, we're going to be forced to go to a fourth and a fifth and a sixth generation of trying to reduce this, all with the cost to the consumers. Now, we should also consider the claim that this will create, I listened to it earlier today, they said this is going to create thousands of jobs. I submit to you, Mr. Chairman, where? Because you really think that in China and India, where the demands are high that they're going to sell American equipment, which is now going to cost more money, that China and India and Europe are going to buy our equipment when they could be buying the air handling equipment out of China and India that's produced cheaper and with a less expensive coolant? Let's be honest with each other, what we're trying to accomplish here. There is a different agenda. We'll let the majority continue to push it through. in a rapid fashion like this. But I urge the Chairman to correct this issue. Please address these other matters that we've raised, that I started off with, from pepper sprays, vending machines, Marines, before it comes to the floor, so that our consumers, our American consumers, can feel like we're truly addressing their problem. And we're not going to do it at affecting their pocketbook. And where the jobs are going to be created, we better start addressing where that's going to happen. Because I'm going to submit to you, I'm not so confident that it's going to happen in America. I'm afraid we're going to be shipping those jobs overseas. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Does any other members seek recognition to speak on the underlying bill? Chair recognizes Representative Dingell for 5 minutes, please.
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. H.R. 5544 requires a phase down in the production and consumption of the listed HFCs by 85% over a 15-year period. Let me repeat, this is a phase down. It's not a ban. When the phase down's complete in 2036, 15% of the baseline levels of production and consumption will still be available. At the subcommittee's legislative hearing in January, witnesses testified that 15% availability is sufficient level to allow niche users to continue to use HFCs. As the EPA witnesses testified, quote, EPA witnesses, the 15% number seems consistent with numbers that we looked at to ensure that we would not have to look at any kind of additional amounts needed in order to service existing equipment, ensure that equipment met its useful lifetime, and ensure that if there were any niche applications that were consumer-based or military or others, that those uses could be met. End of quote. Even if that level was not sufficient, 15 years is a long time to develop substitutes. More importantly, H.R. 5544 includes essential use exemptions to protect niche users who might struggle to find substitutes for their applications. But again, those niche users would have sufficient supply of HFCs even when the phase down is complete, such that they don't need to seek an essential use exemption. This bill is written in such a way that it protects any niche users from adverse impacts, providing flexibility for them to continue operation without disruption. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Are there any other colleagues seeking to speak on the underlying bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to talk about specifically Section 7 of this bill. I have some major concerns with it. Section 7 is very poorly designed. It gives the EPA new discretionary legal authority to prohibit or restrict the use of an HFC in a sector or subsector. Unlike the rest of the bill, which is not sector or subsector specific, and phases down but not out the use of HFCs, these provisions in Section 7 allow EPA to ban an HFC for a specific sector or subsector. Secondly, Section 7 does not require the EPA to make a finding on which to base one of these bans. This means the EPA can decide to regulate a sector or subsector's use of an HFC without any other reason besides that it can or could. And any judicial review of that provision would be moot. On top of that, there are a number of criteria EPA is supposed to consider as part of this rule, such as consumer safety, availability of substitutes, and maximizing public health protections, but none of them are required to determine any final rule. In other words, the following concerns are only options for the EPA to ensure as part of the rule. Any administration that regulates by picking winners and losers will have a field day with this authority. That brings me to one of the more troubling parts of Section 7, the petition process. These provisions allow any entity, from competing businesses to foreign powers to ideologically driven interests, to petition EPA to engage in rulemaking to ban or severely restrict HFCs in a sector or subsector based on no clear standard. This provision could legally allow folks to clear the market, run industries out of business, or otherwise manipulate the marketplace for their own desires. And Mr. Chairman, containing costs does not appear to be a priority in this legislation. Most significantly, Section 7 does nothing to protect against consumer cost increases. By consumers, I mean the end user and residential consumers. I urge opposition to the bill as written and believe any future consideration of this legislation should be without this Section 7 language. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? Representative Paragon, for what purpose do you seek recognition? Strike the last word.
Strike the last word.
Strike the last word. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Some of my colleagues who oppose this legislation have argued that H.R. 5544 will impose higher costs on consumers. It's important to consider costs to consumers. Fortunately, the cost to consumers associated with phasing down HFCs will be negligible in today's dollars by the middle of the decade. Today, the cost is between $123 and $156. This is a remarkable decline in cost, despite multiple refrigerant transitions since 1973, all of which have been guided by a federal framework. These transitions lead to improvements in equipment design, resulting in new models that are more energy efficient, use smaller refrigerant charge sizes, and leak less. We've also heard an argument based in part on comparing current online prices of HFCs and HFC substitutes. This strikes me as overly simplistic and frankly misleading analysis. Some of the numbers we've heard thrown around, which again suggest that the cost of substitutes are unreasonably high.
Yourself as a policeman, a knife or a club or a chain, and you're trying to subdue them, and you say, could you come a little closer, please? That's kind of what we're talking about here. We're talking about cost. We're also talking about cost to lives of our first responders. If you visualize yourself as an outdoorsman and a bear is coming into your campground or coming up close to you, could you come just a little closer, please? You tell the bear, because that's exactly what we're talking about. The purpose of H.R. 5544 is to rapidly reduce and eventually ban the use of HFCs. And we are told the cost to consumers will be small and the benefits will be good for the planet. I'm not talking about the cost to consumers. I'm talking about the cost in human life here. We should look closely and fully at the unintended harms before we rush legislation through this committee. In some cases, the replacement products for HFCs risk more than just harm to people's wallets, as I've mentioned. Consider the red pepper spray. It's used by law enforcement to protect themselves and the public from violent criminal acts and outdoor enthusiasts against bear attacks in the wilderness. It also helps women feel safer against predators and in other dangerous situations. Police and repellent manufacturers tell us these products won't work as well or as reliably with substitute HFCs. Lower pressure of substitutes means that you have to be a lot closer. The guy with the chain or the knife, could you come just a little closer so my red pepper spray will be effective on you? Think about that for a second. Law enforcement will have to stand closer to a violent subject in order to use red pepper spray products. Consumers using the bear deterrent will need to be closer to an attacking bear for the spray to reach the bear, according to a letter to Congress. The higher boiling point for substitutes means the products won't work in cold temperatures. Now that's handy too. The substitutes, when mixed in pepper formulation, make it flammable, unlike HFCs. This means law enforcement cannot use spray with their tasers. It means workers on oil and gas pipelines are at greater risk. Who knows how else this legislation will adversely affect performance or cause injuries, not to their pocketbook, but to them physically. There are clear and harmful consequences for forcing substitutes to HFCs in certain consumer products. I urge a no vote on the bill in its current form, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? For what purpose does the member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Phasing down HFCs is both good for the economy and the environment. When you look at the nearly 30 organizations supporting it, these are usually committees and groups that are fighting like cats and dogs in this committee. And yet today, they're all asking us to pass this bill. The United States Chamber of Commerce, Environmental Defense Fund, League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, Air Conditioning Contractors Association, National Association of Manufacturers, National Marine Manufacturers Association, a host of public health advocates. And they know because it'll support 33,000 new manufacturing jobs according to the staff analysis and boost our U.S. economy by $12.5 billion and increase our global share of the market by 25%. But I think as importantly, this is a bipartisan bill. If our colleagues on both sides of the aisle are truly going to pivot to tackle climate change, this is the easy one. This is the easy vote to take to show that we're all taking climate change seriously. As we lead the world transition on HFCs, we could reduce climate change by 0.5 degree with America leading the way. There's a reason why a lot of these companies that are new and forming in the United States have amazing futures in market capitalization. Take a company like Tesla that's working on the electric cars with a market capitalization of $100 billion, one of the most valuable auto companies in the world now, because that's where our economy is going and that is where innovation's going. We have an opportunity with this bill to, in a bipartisan way, both help American innovation and help the planet, and I urge everyone to vote for it.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any other colleagues seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill?
Wish to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized, Representative Flores, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been told that phasing out and banning HFCs in the United States will be relatively painless for the consumers and, of course, good for reducing emissions. But we've heard this morning, and we heard in the testimony of the earlier hearing about this bill, that this affects aircraft passengers, crews. We've heard that it affects people that use or need personal protection products, like Mr. Long just talked about. We've also heard that the replacement products are flammable and sometimes unstable because of their higher boiling points. So we all need to remember that in a competitive world, if there are efficiencies and innovations, companies will strive to take advantage of those innovations to produce more and better products for consumers at less cost. During consideration of this bill, we haven't looked at industries that do not have ready, innovative substitutes for HFCs, nor have we looked at what that means for the consumer. For example, industrial refrigerators are critical for keeping food safe and fresh, and I might point out, in light of the coronavirus issue, pharmaceutical products and vaccines through all aspects of those product delivery chains, from farms to grocery stores to our tables in our restaurants and our homes to our doctor's offices. Yet available information indicates there are no commercial or economic substitutes for HFCs used in industrial refrigerators. What is the true impact of H.R. 5544 on that industry and the downstream consequences for consumer perishables, healthcare goods, and other goods? We did not explore that in the committee, and yet we're moving this flawed, rushed bill. Further, the bill does not protect small businesses from the patchwork of state HFC requirements. And based on some of the testimony we heard this morning, I don't think some people understand what preemption means. The lack of preemption, for example, will have a significant impact on small businesses that do business across state lines. The lack of standardization in state law while trying to transition to the new federal standards is particularly hard on small businesses like the vending machine companies that already deploy refrigerated vending machines across many state lines. And there are many other examples. The lack of preemption will also affect consumers more broadly. If changes to compliance standards drive up prices for service, repair, and replacement materials, as we suspect that they will. The administration reportedly has objected to these provisions, stating that, quote, the transition from hydrofluorocarbon use in heating, ventilation, and air conditioning and refrigeration industry is a matter that should be applied consistently across the country and must include a strong preemption clause for states, unquote. The more we look at the effects of this bill, the more we see risk to the American consumer. We should work to provide maximum consumer benefits, not restrict them, while protecting the environment. As it is written, I cannot support this legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? For what purpose does Representative Matsui seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a co-sponsor of H.R. 5544, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Leadership Act of 2020, I am pleased that the committee is taking swift and decisive action to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. Nearly 100 countries, including Mexico and Canada, have already committed to phasing down HFCs, paving the way to a future without these potent greenhouse gases. This international commitment is signaling to the world that the industry is headed in an HFC-free direction, and markets are already shifting accordingly, with countries like China leaping at the opportunity to lead in this space. By this standard, the U.S. is already falling behind. We cannot afford to continue ceding our leadership to other nations. It will risk American jobs and prosperity, and will have catastrophic consequences on the environment. Moreover, while HFCs are not categorized as ozone-depleting substances, they pose their own risks in that they range from 50 to 15,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide and can persist in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. The IPCC has already warned us. We have at this point just 10 years to act swiftly on climate change, and we must start now. Our nation has historically thrived on a can-do attitude in which our constituents, businesses, and governing bodies at the state and local level come together to solve whatever problem is before us. I know that my colleagues on this committee stand ready to do what is necessary to prevent further warming of our planet and the devastating impacts of climate change. With the right policy, we can work in tandem with the American manufacturing sector and lead the world in cutting-edge jobs and innovation. For our children and grandchildren, we must act, and H.R. 5544 is an important component of our strategy. I am pleased to be a co-sponsor of this important legislation and encouraged that this bipartisan legislation is moving forward. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? Representative from Georgia, Representative Carter, why do you seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chairman, we're marking up H.R. 5544, the AMI Leadership Act, which would phase down the use of HFCs in the United States and transition to the next generation of technologies. While I agree that we should be looking to always improve the substances we use manufacturing and in our daily lives, I firmly believe we need to ensure that our actions in Congress don't create negative effects. For instance, I have the honor and privilege of representing over 110 miles of pristine Georgia coastline. It's a place I love dearly and remains largely unspoiled due to extensive efforts to protect the environment. As you can imagine, boating remains a major industry, basis for employment and source of recreation for thousands of people. We've heard from the boat manufacturers that they have real concerns about what this legislation would mean for the HFC-based structural foams used in the production of boats. While I respectfully disagree with my colleague on the other side of the aisle, you will find in our booklet a letter from the National Marine Manufacturers Association that expresses a number of concerns with this legislation. The foams that are used to help reduce the weight and displacement of the vessels, ensuring better gas mileage and lower levels of fuel burn, could be impacted by this. In addition to the concerns regarding structural foams, additional concerns are raised about a lack of federal preemption. These are issues I hope we can continue to work on before advancing this legislation so that we can ensure any final product coming out of this committee reflects the willingness to assist all industries that are impacted. Mr. Chair, I ask that we continue to work together, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? For what purpose does Representative Duncan seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Among the main reasons we have been told that we need to pass this bill is because the world is already going in this direction and we don't need to be left behind. In fact, one of the main reasons air conditioning, heating, and ventilation equipment manufacturers and some of the refrigerant companies want this bill so badly is because under the terms of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, the U.S.-made products would not be eligible for export into the markets of the non-Kigali Amendment parties. Yet neither the Obama administration nor the Trump administration have submitted Kigali to the Senate for its ratification. So this bill appears to be an attempt to work around that ratification process. Congress is effectively constraining the country to follow terms of a treaty it did not ratify. Now, that doesn't seem right. There's a process set forth in the Constitution. As we heard in the legislative hearing and here today, this proposal is far from consequence-free for the large number of Americans who use cooling and HFC-reliant products like metered dose inhalers. Regardless of what assurances, oral or otherwise, were made by the United States in negotiating the Kigali Amendment, the Montreal Protocol, I find it difficult to believe that this is the most durable way to execute them. Right now, the White House has expressed opposition to this bill, so I'm not sure why we're going through this exercise, and especially not making pro-consumer changes like preemption or removing the threat that future administrations will ratchet up the cost on consumers. Now, I know some of my colleagues are eager to see major reductions on HFCs happen as soon as possible. But damaging the Constitution by passing something that should have been ratified by the Senate and harming consumers for those ends is not the kind of precedent that we should be making. If hardworking Americans are going to have to sacrifice for the good of the globe, our Constitution must be followed. That's important. And the Senate should first ratify the Kigali Amendment. So I oppose this bill. I urge my colleagues to oppose it as well. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? For what purpose does the member seek recognition?
Excuse me, I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman from Delaware is recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clarify that this is a phase down, not a phase out. And I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto, to clarify one of the comments made earlier.
I thank the gentlelady from Delaware. The January 13th, 2020 letter by the National Marine Manufacturers Association to this committee, which has already been submitted in the record. Dear Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus, the National Marine Manufacturers Association welcomes the opportunity to express our support for the American Innovation and Manufacturing Leadership Act of 2020, H.R. 5544, which we have today, including provisions that require gradually phasing down the use of hydrofluorocarbons and offer suggestions on how to strengthen the legislation. I, too, have manufacturing for boats and marine craft in our district. It is a way of life in Florida, and I really think it's important that we set the record straight that manufacturers across the board, including the National Association of Manufacturers and, yes, the National Marine Manufacturers Association, have specifically supported this legislation, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's pointing out the letter again. This is a letter that I had submitted for the record earlier in an earlier committee meeting. I do want to point out that what I said, and if you will look back on the record, you'll find what I said is that they expressed concerns, and they do, later on in the text of this letter, express concerns about the legislation, about the impact it's going to have on the boating industry, concern that the legislation does not preempt states from setting their own standards, concern that there's not a viable substitute at this time. So that's the point I was making, that they have concerns about that, about this legislation, the National Marine Manufacturers Association, and I yield back.
And yet they support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The woman yields back, and I would just point out that essential use exceptions could be issued when no substitute is available, and this legislation does ensure that niche users are protected. So, any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? For what purpose does the gentleman
To strike the
seek
last
recognition?
word.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if my colleague from Georgia wants a little more time here, but I just was a little confused on page 23 of the text, the AINS. On line 22, it says, authority, the administrator may, by regulation and in accordance with this section, prohibit or restrict, including through a graduated schedule, the use of a regulated substance in a sector or subsector in which such regulated substance is used. Prohibit's a pretty well-defined term, I think. And yet I think I heard just a minute ago that this bill doesn't prohibit, but it certainly would give the authority to the administrator to prohibit. I would yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, I want to point out, yes, the National Marine Manufacturers Association is trying to work with this legislation, but just as the point has just been made, these we are, through this legislation, you will be giving the administrator, much broad jurisdiction over this. And as they have pointed out here, there's not a viable substitute at this time. So the National Marine Manufacturers Association is saying that they want to work with this, but there's not a viable substitute at this time. It does not preempt states from setting their own rules. They have concerns, and those concerns are outlined in this letter. And I yield back.
And I appreciate the gentleman's comments. And on the exemption issue, on page 18 of the AINS, it talks about how you would petition an authorization. The administrator may, by regulation, allocate to a person additional production allowances or consumption allowances to authorize the production or consumption, respectively, beginning with calendar year 2034 for a period up to 5 years or on it goes. So the point is you could have a phase down already in place before the door opens for this exemption to take place, because it doesn't take place until 2034. So I think that causes another problem here in the majority's bill. So with that, I yield back balance.
The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the underlying bill? Anyone? I believe that concludes the list of those desiring to speak to the underlying bill. If there's no further discussion or amendments, we will proceed to a vote on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5544, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Okay. So the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on favorably forwarding H.R. 5544 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor of favorably forwarding H.R. 5544 as amended to the full committee will signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed will signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes
Mr.
have it.
Chairman,
Mr. Shimkus?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Representative Shimkus has asked for a recorded vote. Those in favor of favorably forwarding H.R. 5544 as amended to the full committee will say aye. Those opposed will say no. Will the clerk please shall call the roll?
Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye. Ms. Berrigan? Ms. Berrigan, aye. Mr. McEachin? Ms. Blunt-Rochester? Ms. Blunt-Rochester, aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Mr. McEachin? I'm sorry. Mr. McNerney, thinking of him. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Ruiz? Ms. Ruiz, aye. Mrs. Dingell? Mrs. Dingell, aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers votes no. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long? Mr. Long, no. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores, no. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye.
Does any member still need to record her or his vote? Does any member wish to change her or his vote? If not, the clerk will call the tally, please.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, final passage, the ayes, well, not final passage, but forwarding. The ayes are 13, the nays are 9.
The vote is 13 ayes to 9 noes. H.R. 5544, as amended, is forwarded to the full committee. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills consistent with the actions taken by this subcommittee today. And with that, the subcommittee is now adjourned.